delighted to introduce Frédérique, who is the author of a book of the same title as our program tonight, Garden Allies. And that was just published about a year ago. And Frédérique was a director of education at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. Prior to that, she was founding director of the Sustainable Landscape Professional Certification Program at Sonoma State University. And there she revived the garden classroom program and established an entomology outreach program. She holds a master's degree in biology with an emphasis on ecological principles of sustainable landscapes. Prior to her graduate studies, Frédérique founded and operated an organic nursery specializing in heirloom vegetables and culinary herbs from around the globe. She also authored a 10-year-long series of articles entitled Garden Allies for Pacific Horticulture magazine. So tonight's talk will tell us about the various garden allies and the roles that they play, birds, mammals, reptiles, and insects, and how we can encourage them. Please welcome Frédérique.
Hey, thank you. Let me get my screen up here. And here we are. An introduction to life in the landscape, the garden allies. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoy Marin County and all that it offers botanically. I would like to mention that all the drawings that you see in this program were the work of Craig Latker, who is an illustrator and landscape architect locally. And this is a new drawing right here with the sunflower bees. I'm hoping it's for the next book. And so before we get started, I just want to mention, we often think garden allies are pollinators. And in fact, there are all kinds of other garden allies, and they're not necessarily all pollinators, and they aren't all insects. And we are going to take a look at some of these. And we will be discussing some science this evening. But first, a few more pretty pictures. And this is going, okay. There we go. We're going to be talking about life beneath our feet, what happens in the soil. We are going to talk about some flower visitors. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into parasitism and predation. We're going to meet the beetles. And then the garden commons is a little bit like that drawer in your kitchen where you put everything, you're not quite sure where to put it. It's in the garden commons here. Then I talk about the ground crew and beyond. And finally, vertebrates. But first, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the underlying science and what got me so excited to begin with. So I'm assuming that as members of CNPS, you are probably familiar with integrated pest management. You may not know that there are 3 types of biological control. And so just very briefly, we're going to go over this in a little more detail. Classical biological control involves releasing insects for what we're hoping is permanent control of a pest issue. Augmentative biological control, we're releasing insects for a temporary control. And conservation biological control, which is where I'm going to focus most of my attention tonight, we are attracting and establishing populations of natural enemies of undesirable insects and other pest species. So this is all based on cost-benefit analyses. UC Davis developed this originally, and the cost-benefit analyses are very important if you're a farmer and you need to put food on the table, and you can see that you may even end up using conventional pesticides. As gardeners, our cost-benefit analyses involves more aesthetics. So it's our decision-making is a little bit different. So classical biological control, when we think about classical biological control, that's usually what we're thinking about when we think biocontrol. But it is the introduction of the natural enemy of a non-native pest, native to the same region as the pest, and you're hoping that it will establish permanently. And Charles Valentine Riley here, Chief of the Division of Entomology of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, is the father of biological control in the United States. So we had citrus crops. I used to say at the turn of the century, but it's really the turn of the previous century. We had an insect come in that devastated the citrus industry in California. And it was Charles Riley who thought, gee, where'd this insect come from? And there must be something there that would control it. And it turned out that this cottony cushion scale, which was devastating citrus, was from Australia. So Charles Riley sent somebody over to Australia, and that person came back with a parasitic fly, which is actually very effective near the coast, and the Vidalia Beetle, which reminds you of a ladybug because it's related and is actually a type of lady beetle. But what was found quickly is that this type of biological control is only effective under specific conditions. And one of those is that it is most effective in perennial systems like orchards. It can be expensive to do this, and it's partly because of the risk of host switching. So this can be especially an issue when we've introduced something to control a weed, because once it has controlled the weed or controlled the insect that we want it to control, it may switch to something else that we don't want it to attack. And so testing has made this type of biological control very expensive because we have to test really thoroughly before we release something new into the environment, of course. Augmentative biological control is what we're thinking of when we see ladybugs being sold. And I would recommend we not buy ladybugs, but instead attract them to our gardens. But we are really introducing these natural enemies and only expecting temporary control. Again, it can be expensive because you're buying insects. And there are two different strategies here: inoculation and inundation. Inundation is what we're doing when we release ladybugs. We are expecting an immediate reduction that we don't usually get in that particular situation. And so here's what I like to do, and what I think is wonderful for gardeners. Okay? It's integrated pest management for people with gardens that are diverse. And so you're preserving and enhancing your locally resident natural enemies. And you will get permanent control with this. And they may be native, but there are some non-native insects that have been introduced, like some of the parasitic wasps that are actually ubiquitous now and helpful in our garden. This is the only approach I know of to pest management that creates a positive feedback loop. And we do this through two major strategies. We are reducing pesticides and we're providing resources. And the more we do that, the more of these beneficial insects and other organisms we can invite to our garden. So there are a lot of ecosystem benefits to this, of course, and I'm not going to read all of these to you. I think you're probably familiar with most of them, but really what we're looking for is the long-term sustainability of our human-managed landscapes. So why native plants? I give this talk to a lot of groups that are not Native Plant Society groups. So this particular issue may need a little more explanation than it will for you all. I'm expecting everybody who is tuned in this evening is a fan of native plants. And so natives are supporting ecosystem health. Of course, I have non-native plants in my garden. A lot of gardeners do. But I always want to throw in the caution about plants with berries. If you're growing plants that have berries on them that birds may be spreading into the outside environment, reconsider and plant natives. We have a lot of beautiful plants that have berries on them that are native. Okay. So what this is all based on really is coevolution. And you may be familiar with Paul Ehrlich, entomologist, and Peter Raven, botanist, and they wrote this paper, Butterflies and Plants, a Study in Coevolution, a term that people were not yet familiar with at that time. And they were studying this close relationship between the speciation of butterfly species and their associated plant species. But really, this was about caterpillars, because butterflies will nectar on all kinds of different plants. But the caterpillars often very closely associated with the plants on which they feed. And so when you hear about the evolutionary arms race, this is what we're talking about. The monarch caterpillar eats milkweed. The milkweed gets more toxic. The caterpillar evolves to be able to overcome that toxicity, and so on. So this leads in the environment to a lot of speciation and specialization. So these herbivorous insects are linked with certain plants, but their predators and parasitoids are also more or less linked, sometimes very closely, sometimes not as much. But the bottom line is that native plants are superior in supporting biodiversity in our gardens and in the larger environment. So herbivorous insects then are the best reason of all to be planting native plants. It's a role in the food web that we don't usually discuss in horticulture because we don't usually think about our plants being eaten. But insects are actually half of all biodiversity on this planet. And one of the reasons they're so important is that the plants that are converting the sun's energy to provide nutrients for everything are making a product, plant material, that isn't terribly digestible for a lot of the organisms on the planet. So herbivorous insects are actually 25 to 35% of all insects, and they convert embodied plant energy for use by all these other animals, either directly or indirectly. And 90% of them are specialists to some degree or another. If you are not yet familiar with Doug Tallamy's work, especially his first book, Bringing Nature Home, he made some really great arguments about why we need herbivorous insects, and he has followed it up with a number of other interesting books. So maybe you don't like insects terribly. A lot of people don't love these plant-eating insects, but it's important to know most of us love birds. 96% of birds are feeding their offspring arthropods, so insects and related species. And 70% continue to eat arthropods as adults. So although we often think about bird feeders as being seed, really we should be putting insects out there. Half of their diet is Lepidoptera, so butterflies and moth, generally the caterpillars. And birds are incredibly important at providing pest control. And sadly, US bird populations are way down over the past 40 years. And part of the reason is pesticides and these big monocultural agricultural systems that we have now. So this is all connected, right? And the food web really is a web. And so we're always being told, let's promote biodiversity. We need more biodiversity in our gardens and the wilderness. But we rarely talk about what biodiversity actually is. So I want to talk about that for a couple of minutes. And there are different ways to look at biodiversity. Ecology, the science of ecology, is actually a very math-rich science. There are a lot of different ways to calculate biodiversity. The factor that we're usually thinking of when we think biodiversity is we're thinking about species richness, which is simply the number of species that are present. But another thing that is really important in our calculations is the abundance of each, the number of individuals of each that is present. So that is more important than richness alone. And that leads me to functional biodiversity. By the way, this is a ladybug pupa right here. And I should probably mention photographs, unless they have somebody else's name under them or mine. So the identity of the species in the system and the role that it's actually serving are actually really critical. And that leads us to insurance species and high functional group biodiversity. So this is the idea that, say, we have aphids in the garden, and maybe you've released one species of ladybug that will attack the aphids. But that's just one species. And what happens if that ladybug gets a virus or some other thing in the environment that is going to knock it out of its role? It's really helpful to have other species that can come in and perform the same ecological service. So that's high functional group biodiversity. If you have a lot of different organisms that can attack aphids, you're going to keep your aphids in better balance. And it also leads to resilience in your ecosystem. So this one species of ladybug got knocked out by a virus, but the other things stepped in and your ecosystem then bounces back. There are a lot of factors that are going to promote biodiversity. And these are all great features of gardens. And you can see that conservation biological control is actually more difficult to accomplish in an agricultural system, especially in a monocrop. In a garden, it's much easier for us to create a habitat that is going to promote this sort of pest management. And of course, when you're doing this, you're promoting the pollinators that we're always talking about. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how insects feed on plants. So we don't really think usually about pollinators as being insects that feed on plants, but that is exactly what they're doing. They're just feeding on them in a different way that doesn't put ragged holes in the leaves. This is what we're usually thinking about when we think about plant feeding insects. Here we have some caterpillars, and let me just point out how good most of these herbivorous insects are at hiding, because they are really good food for birds and lizards and certain mammals, and they have developed all kinds of strategies of camouflage and mimicry and toxicity to avoid being eaten. So here's a little puzzle over here. This is a Clarkia, and it is being pollinated there by a little bee. But those little ragged holes there in the petals were created by a leafcutter bee. The leafcutter bee is a pollinator, so it's valuable to us, but then it is also performing as an herbivore here by cutting holes in our flowers. So I really try, I'm not always successful in eliminating these words of pest and beneficial from my vocabulary. And as I said, I'm not always successful. Sometimes things really do behave as a pest, especially things that have come from another country. Lanternfly comes to mind. It's not here in California yet, but it seems to be on its way. Climate change is also factoring in now, though. And so we have some native insects that are becoming problems. A lot of the borers, for instance, and trees are getting stressed from climate change, and the borers come in. They may be native. But I try and use the word pest judiciously, because everything is eating something else. And so whether or not something is a pest can be very subjective. So over here on the left, this is a syrphid fly larva, and a lot of people, the first time they see something like this, think, what is this? You know, it's a creepy crawly thing. It's on my plant. I should probably kill it. No, This is a beneficial, and it's going to be eating things that you don't want on your plants. On the right here, I don't know if you've ever noticed these. These are on California Bay. And this is a little packet that is sewn up by a moth larva. And it's not really bothering us in any way. Actually, I think they're kind of architecturally pretty cool. And over here, we have a spider that caught a fly, and we don't know, maybe the fly is a beneficial fly. Maybe it was a pest. The spider maybe get eaten by a bird. So again, I'm trying to think of having a food web approach in general. So we're back to some pretty pictures. And I am going to sort of follow the general format of my book. I do one reading out of the book, and it is right here. And it's about soil, one of my favorite topics. The air into which plants extend their stems, leaves, flowers, and fruit is a virtual desert compared to the soil in which their roots seek anchorage, water, and nourishment. This is why the health and sustainability of any landscape begins with stewardship of its most valuable resource, the soil underfoot. Soil is not simply a canvas on which we paint our beautiful plant picture, but a living substrate. A good gardener, before anything else, tends the soil, the foundation of the landscape. We think that we are growing plants, but really we are growing soil. When we proudly show off our prized tomatoes, we could just as proudly show off a handful of the fertile soil from whence they came. Fertile soil includes a complement of humus, organic matter that has decomposed until it has reached a stable state. We have many garden allies, seen and unseen, to thank for that. As Leonardo da Vinci remarked long ago, we know more about the movement of celestial bodies than about the soil underfoot. It is still true today. Just about every available surface under our feet is teeming with life. Incredibly, even the thin film of water that coats soil particles and lines pores in the soil harbors microscopic organisms that navigate those minute spaces. Fascinating stories emerge from the soil, stories about creatures as small and numerous as bacteria, as large as giant earthworms, and as musical as crickets. A mere teaspoon of soil may harbor over 1 billion bacteria. So I'm going to continue on. This is a sand wasp right here, Bembex species. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of organisms that we are not going to have time to really talk about. But let's just take a look at a few of them. So I happen to really love these Pseudo Scorpions. You may have seen them in books occasionally where they prey on book lice, but they can be found under bark and in moss and other places like that. And this is one of my favorite books here. This illustration came out of that book, Life in the Soil, a guide for naturalists and gardeners. And if you're interested in how soil forms, how does just crushed rock become soil? Jim Nardi is a really great explainer of the science behind how rock becomes soil. And you can see 1 cup of undisturbed native soil and all that it can contain. Then we have earthworms. You may already know that the night crawlers that we find in our gardens are not native in California, but are yet welcomed in our gardens. On the right here is an earthworm egg. So 1 single earthworm can produce 10 pounds of castings in a year. You can see how important they are to the fertility of soil. They accelerate decomposition, and the tunnels that they're creating provide channels for the penetration of roots, water, air, and nutrients. And I am a big fan of no-till methods in general. I don't like to till soil. I don't like to chop up earthworms. But beyond chopping up earthworms, you are also really reducing the natural structure of the soil All those little channels are really important. And then I put nutrient facilitators and decomposers here on the same slide because they are often the same thing. And they are a lot of what is responsible for turning that crushed rock into soil. A lot of them are invisible to the naked eye, but the soil is going to seem absent of life if they aren't there. So things like bacteria, protozoans, actinomycetes, that wonderful smell that forest humus has is the result of the work of actinomycetes, which are related to a lot of our antibiotics. Many of these contribute to the health of the soil. But I am going to move on now to flower visitors on the wing. So by the same token that we tend to think when we think garden allies, we think pollinators. We think habitat and we think, well, I need to plant flowers. Flowers are what we need for habitat. Really, there's a lot more to providing habitat than flowers, but there is no doubt flowers are really important. And there are many, many insects besides the traditional pollinators that are flower visitors and that are benefiting from the nectar and pollen. So always we think bees, and bees are by far our most important pollinators. They are the only insects that purposely collect and carry pollen around. And they have branched hairs on certain parts of their body. And we've also found they have an electrostatic charge. So they're like pollen magnets in gathering that. And there are over 4,000 species in the United States. We have over 16 or 1,800, depending on who's counting, in California. 70% of native bees are solitary, and 70%, not necessarily the same, are ground nesters. And almost all these bees are stingless, or they can't penetrate human skin, and only the females sting. And the solitary wasps are very gentle. They're not going to be chasing you around the yard. These are sunflower bees on the left here. These are the males. They don't have anywhere to go in the evening, and so you can find them on stalks of, in this case, it was a poppy in the yard. And let me see, is there anything else I would like to tell you about bees? I do love bees, but it is not really a focus for me in my work. The bees are out there doing their pollinating, and I'm out there looking at all the other things that might be visiting. So moths and butterflies are Lepidoptera. Only 10% of the Lepidoptera are butterflies. We don't notice a lot of the other 90% because they're out at night, and many of them are tiny and brown and inconspicuous. There are a few moths that are brightly colored and day flying, but here's the thing, most butterflies are really not very good pollinators. Some of the moths are, they have hairier bodies and they really get down in the flowers. But look at the monarchs that are perching on flowers, because that's what they do. They perch and then they put their long proboscis down into the flower to collect nectar. And they're not really collecting much in the way of pollen. They don't transfer a lot of pollen. Monarchs are very important for some other reasons, but pollination isn't really the thing. And then we have the hunting wasps. The hunting wasps are all flower visitors in their adult forms. And the way that I am defining hunting wasps is that they carry their prey off to their nests. There are different ways that we can look at the differences between hunting wasps and parasitoid wasps. And like a lot of things in nature, it's a bit of a continuum, and where we draw the lines between what is exclusively a hunter as opposed to a parasitoid can be a little vague at times. And there are some wonderful books out there that are exclusively on wasps now. So a lot of these hunting wasps are solitary. The adults are feeding on nectar and sometimes on pollen, but their larvae are carnivorous. And that's one of the big things that differentiates them from bees, which are just eating pollen and nectar. So the bee larvae are herbivorous and the wasp larvae are carnivorous. And generally speaking, what they're doing is they're paralyzing their prey and they're stalking it in their nest. And then the prey is eaten by the larvae. Usually the vital parts are being eaten last. And then we have flies. Okay, so flies are actually wonderful. Yes, there are house flies and there are flies that spread disease, but most flies actually are either innocuous or very beneficial. And for the most part, the flies that you see visiting flowers are beneficial. So we have syrphid flies like the one on the right here, which is a bee mimic. They come in all kinds of sizes, little tiny ones. There's big ones that even look like bumblebee mimics, and they don't all eat aphids as larvae. Okay, although it is one of the reasons why we want them in our garden. There is one that I need to mention called the narcissus fly that actually eats daffodil bulbs, but it's never been a real issue that I know of. On the left here is a tachinid fly, and tachinids are usually bristly. This particular tachinid has little combs on its legs there. But a lot of these are nectar feeders as adults. And the tachinids are particularly interesting because they parasitize a really broad range of insects. And most of them are more or less generalists. A lot of them specialize on sawflies. Some of them parasitize caterpillars. And if you have raised monarch caterpillars, you have probably had them parasitized by tachinid flies at some point. It's a sad thing to see. Well, here's a fantastic photograph taken by a friend of mine, Philip Van Solen, who was the owner of California Flora up in Fulton, just past Santa Rosa, wonderful native plant nursery. And he sent me this a long time ago and said, what kind of a bee is that? Well, it turns out it's a fly. It's a syrphid fly. And it is one of the only pollinators that we know of for Epipactis gigantea, the California stream orchid. Now, orchids have all kinds of interesting pollination mechanisms. In this case, the syrphid fly crawls inside the flower, and these pollinia, the pollen sacs, get slapped down on its back where they stick. And then when it enters the next flower, some of those pollinia come off. And this particular fly was so loaded, I don't even know how it was able to get off of that flower. So we are going to dig a little deeper into this difference between predators and parasites. This here is a robber fly. It's a ferocious predator. It will kill and eat many individuals in the course of its life. And I'm sorry, I have to peek at my notes. It's been a while since I've done this. And so I'm going to go back here and say, we often hear the term parasitoid when we're talking about parasitic insects. So there are some differences. A parasite typically lives on or inside its host. It's usually far smaller than the host, and it rarely kills its host. It's usually bound to a single host, or it may move from one species as a host to a different species as a host, but it is bound to the hosts, and it will hardly ever kill its host. So think about malaria. If you die from malaria, then all of that parasite dies with you. The parasitoid adult may be much larger than its host. And while the larva will live on or inside the host, the adult stage is free living. Okay? It's usually an insect, and it's usually a fly or a wasp. And with very few natural world exceptions, it kills its host. Okay? So the flies, I think I mentioned the tachinids, they tend to be bristly. This one on the left here, you can kind of see the bristles on its abdomen there. And on the right here is a bee fly, and bee flies are really common in our gardens, and they are not a bee, they actually are a fly, but they look a little fuzzy like a bumblebee. And this really long proboscis is actually a mouth part. They don't sting. They do parasitize ground nesting bees and wasps. So again, we have an insect, it's a pollinator, but it is parasitizing other insects that we would like to have. Nature is complicated. And this is one of the reasons why it's useful to just make a beautiful habitat and let live and let live. So the wasps are some of our tiniest allies. I don't even have a photograph of some of the very smallest ones, but they are so small that they can parasitize, in some cases, butterfly eggs. And those little dust motes you see floating around flowers sometimes in your garden are actually insects. There can be egg parasitoids, larval parasitoids, pupal parasitoids, and clearly an egg parasitoid is the best one, because then that egg is never going to hatch to create issues for you. In some cases, parasitized caterpillars can actually eat more, but they will not survive to reproduce. Okay. And now meet the beetles. Okay. There are so many beetles. 20% of all species of insects are beetles. So we're only going to have time to meet a few. So some of these could easily have been in there with the flower visitors. And again, it was a challenge to categorize all of these different insects, because many beetles are flower visitors as well and could have been put into that area. So we've got a bit of overlap here. And I do want to mention that a lot of the beetles really like late summer blooms, goldenrod and yarrow. They like clusters of small flowers, but they can also be found feeding on many early blooming perennial grasses where they seek pollen and shelter. So here is a lady beetle. There are dozens of species that you can attract to your garden, and only a few that can be purchased, and fewer that want to stick around your garden if you have purchased them. So they eat aphids, some of them do, but they also eat a lot of other soft-bodied insects and eggs. Over here on the right, this is the Mealy Bug Destroyer, and this is its larva below it. And this is a typical story of the wolf in sheep's clothing. It looks kind of like a mealy bug, but it moves faster and it's able to crawl around among the mealy bugs with impunity and feed as much as it wants. A lot of the very tiny lady beetles that are preying on things like scale insects, they're the size of a pinhead. They are so small, and the larvae are actually underneath the scale insects, so you may not even notice them in your garden. But a lot of these lady beetles are flower visitors as adults, and they do like to eat pollen and a little bit of nectar sometimes. So by just growing a good diversity of native plants, you will attract a lot of these to the garden. Okay, soldier beetles are something you don't hear a huge amount about, soldier beetles, but I think that they are one of the very best insects you can have in the garden. They are related to actually blister beetles and fireflies. They're one of our very best insects. The larvae can be found in the soil where they will prey on insects. They pupate in leaf litter, so another reason to be judicious about what you are raking up. They're great for gardens, but not farms, because really they're going to be in sort of what I think of as permanent mulch, leaf litter. The adults and the larvae prey on aphids, caterpillars, grasshopper eggs, mites, and little insects that they find they are reputed to eat cucumber beetle eggs. So make of that what you will. Over the years, as I developed my garden, I had fewer and fewer cucumber beetles until finally they weren't any trouble at all. I don't know if I can attribute that to the abundant soldier beetles, but I do. Here's predaceous ground beetles. Now these look a lot like the darkling beetles that you may also see in your garden. Most beetles are nocturnal, so we don't really notice them. But the predaceous ground beetles can be differentiated from the darkling beetles by their behavior. Well, also these giant mandibles on the ground beetles. But ground beetles are a hunting beetle, and they run. They run down their prey. So when you see a beetle at night and it's dark colored like this and it's running fast, it is probably a predaceous ground beetle. If it's moving slowly, it's an herbivorous darkling beetle. So these are preying, the predaceous ground beetles are preying on caterpillars and beetle grubs and grasshoppers, and some of them are also snail eaters and have a really long head that reaches into snail shells. Pretty cool. They can eat their weight in prey on a daily basis. So we really do welcome these to the garden. And then leaf beetles. I've included leaf beetles here to bring us back to this idea that sometimes we are using insects to control weeds. In this case, St. John's wort. This is the Klamath weed beetle, and it controls Hypericum perforatum, St. John's wort, which is a toxic rangeland weed, and they have been really effective in weed control of this particular plant. And there are also some weevils that we use to control plants, and I believe there's one that is being approved of for star thistle, although I haven't followed up on that recently. So that's it right now for the beetles, and we're going to move on to the garden commons. Familiar garden insects. This is an ambush bug, one of my very favorite of the insects. You can find that sometimes on goldenrod. And here I'm going to look at true bugs, lacewings, dragonflies, mantises. There's a few others. But what is a bug? Okay, the true bugs are distinguished by having piercing, sucking mouth parts. And the word bug is really useful. We use it with pill bugs and ladybugs and bugs in the computer. So bug's a useful word, but in entomology, it really refers just to this one group of insects, the Hemiptera. So they might be herbivorous, or they might be predators. And sometimes you can tell the difference because there are fewer predators than there are herbivorous insects. Herbivorous insects tend to appear in larger numbers. Okay, so here are the true bugs that we used to call Homoptera. They're in parentheses because through the use of DNA, we have discovered they're really not that closely related. There are several different groups now. But I don't want to get into that right now. And for us, it's useful as gardeners to be thinking Homoptera. These are the insects that are the most problematic in our gardens, right? Scale insects, whiteflies, aphids, mealy bugs. And oftentimes you can control these by controlling the ants that are attracted to the sugar that is being produced by the aphids. And this ant is getting ready to attack that ladybug right there and protect its little herd of aphids. We don't often think about dragonflies as being a beneficial insect, but put in a water feature and you will have dragonflies, and they will eat their weight in mosquitoes on a daily basis. And besides which, I think they're as fun to watch as hummingbirds. Okay. And then we have the Orthoptera, and they are really good at disguise because they apparently are very tasty if you're a bird. So katydids, by the way, are omnivorous. This is a katydid nymph on the right. And on the left is a desert grasshopper that is doing a very good job of hiding. Okay. And now here's the mantises. So mantises are not related to grasshoppers, although I would prefer they be related to grasshoppers, but they are actually more closely related to cockroaches and termites. And if you ever turn over one of those Madagascan cockroaches, the hissing cockroaches that often show up in insect zoos, you will see these same sort of raptorial legs underneath that cockroach. So native species are the best. These are generalist predators, and I usually ask people to please don't buy these Chinese mantises. They compete with the native mantises, and although they're fun to raise, they're not native. So lacewings, one of the few insects that is actually worth buying and introducing to your garden. They will establish a permanent population. Their larvae eat aphids. The adults are nocturnal and they eat nectar. And they're also brown lacewings that are even less conspicuous than the green ones. So sometimes these will come to porch lights at night and you'll see them there. And then the ground crew and beyond. Here's one of my favorite little spiders, Phidippus johnsonii, which is the red velvet backed jumping spider. So here we include all of these non-insect invertebrates, myriapods, which simply means many-footed. And again, we have this behavioral differentiation with centipedes are hunters and they run fast. They also can sting, so don't pick them up. They're good predators in the garden. And the millipedes have a more rounded look and they move slowly. They're herbivorous. Yeah. And then spiders. I always ask people, don't be afraid of spiders. They actually are so beneficial in the garden. Most of them can't pierce human skin and they do tend to be very shy. And some of them, as you can see here, are quite beautiful. In the book, I also cover snails and slugs and galls and pathogens and some other things that we won't have time for this evening. I want to talk about vertebrates for a minute here. This is a bush tit, one of my favorite little garden birds. And of course, there's different habitat needs now. It becomes really clear that it's not all about flowers, that we need shrubs, we need some thorny plants, you might need a bird bath, we need brush piles and rocks and water features and a lot of other things to consider in terms of habitat. There are amphibians in the garden, it is fun to have a water feature and have some tadpoles in there. If you're lucky, you might find some slender salamanders in your garden. Amphibians, of course, are very sensitive to pesticides, so yet another good reason to not be using pesticides in your garden. And then we have reptiles. Now, you're unlikely to have a western pond turtle in your garden, but you never know. They're pretty cool. But you will probably be seeing some lizards and maybe a snake or two, and they are valuable predators in the garden. If you have a rattlesnake that is of concern, there are different organizations that can come and relocate the rattlesnake for you. And then birds, of course. Back to birds. Yes, some birds will nibble on plants, and I have had rows of peas systematically removed by birds right when they sprout. But generally speaking, we welcome birds into our garden, and they do a lot of good pest management. So what can you do to increase habitat? Well, you could build a bat house and put it up on the back of the garage or something. Plant natives, you already know that. but also simply being observant about what is going on in the garden. Sit quietly. And we're often told to use a hand lens when you're looking at insects. And a hand lens is very useful for certain things to look closely, but you know, here's something I love. I'm going to hold them up. These are butterfly binoculars. They are sometimes known as close focusing binoculars. These particular ones are Pentax. They're 6.5 by 21. They also come in 8.5 by 21. So you can sit on your patio with these and get a close-up, magnified look at the bees and butterflies and other things that are visiting your flowers in your garden. They really are a lot of fun and not terribly expensive compared to a lot of birding binoculars. Visit gardens. This is at the Davis Arboretum here. And I find going to any kind of native section at, you know, Berkeley Botanic Garden, I go to the San Francisco Botanic Garden, seek out the native section and just see what is visiting. Slow down and be observant about what is going on there. Be an example. And one of the examples I like to talk about, actually I'm in the middle of doing this in my front yard right now at my new house, which is take out the front lawn and put in habitat. It is amazing how many people want a habitat garden, but they put it in the backyard. And the front yard is still a patch of lawn with a couple of junipers. But by making your front yard into habitat, you serve as an example for your neighbors. Sidewalk strips, for instance, are a wonderful place to put habitat. And you know, we'll meet a lot of neighbors that way, and they have a lot of questions. If you have some concerns that your neighbors may have mixed feelings about it, there are a lot of organizations now that have signs that say, you know, pollinator garden or bee habitat. Oh, here's another example. This is at a winery, Frog Sleep. Frog Sleep has got a wonderful garden. Here is a swimming pool with native plants and boulders. Here are some nice flowers. Join the Master Gardeners. Master Gardeners are the largest volunteer organization in the United States and do an incredible amount of work. So that is a way to contribute. Join or volunteer, Botanic Garden, Native Plant Society, school gardens. School gardens really need you. Join iNaturalist. If you're not familiar with iNaturalist, this is an app you can download to your phone. You can upload photographs of insects that you see in the garden and may not be able to identify. You can get help with the identifications. Bonnie Nickel is a San Diego Native Plant Society member who actually discovered this insect out of its normal range in San Diego. And also I use bugguide.net a lot for identifications, a lot of experts there. Turn off the lights. This is our country and what it looks like at night. This is very confusing for nocturnal critters. So let's turn off the lights. Darksky.org has wonderful information. Plant natives. Here we go. This is my very favorite quote. This is the big meadow at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden where I worked for a while. And here we go. Read Garden Allies. I do have a Facebook page. I don't spend as much time on it as I probably should in this era of social media. I am even less on Instagram, but you can find me on Facebook. And there should be a website coming along one of these days. But I'm going to go back to this picture because I love this meadow. And I just want to say thank you so much for attending this evening.
And thank you, Frédérique.
Okay, so should I stop the share now? Is that
Yes, I think you could.
okay?
And let's see what we have in the chat.
Okay.
We have Bonnie Marks posted the University of California IPM site
Mhm.
there. Harold Hirsch started to ask something about ants and then says sorry, so I don't know.
Oh, in
Harold,
the
you might come
chat.
back in the Q&A.
Here's
And-
the, okay, I see. Here's the
Yeah, and then-
UCIPM site.
You see the chat?
I see
And then
that.
can you raise the native praying mantis?
You know, I have not raised the native praying mantises, but if you found an egg case, there's no reason you could not perhaps introduce them into your own garden.
Right. So might need to look up what that case looks like versus
Right,
the
right. And the cases are really distinctive for the different species of mantises. Is there something on
and I
co-plant?
remember.
Hmm.
Oh yeah, on co-plantings, plants that protect each other. Well, that's a little different from your topic.
It's a little different from my topic, but let me say, so my dad was an entomologist. I grew up loving insects. And when I started really gardening, it was my first semester in college. And I wanted to get a book that told me how to control pests. And I got a book it was a very old Rodale Press book. I'm sure Rodale Press has evolved a lot since then, but they, and it was how to control insects in your garden. And instead of using conventional pesticides, they just told you to use organic pesticides. But the whole book was about spraying the insects that we didn't want. And then in the section on companion planting, one of the plants they recommended was tansy, and that tansy was going to repel pests. Down the road, what was discovered is that tansy was actually attracting the predators and parasitoids that were attacking the pests.
Right.
So nature isn't always as it seems.
No.
So co-plantings, you know, I don't know how much they are really protecting each other.
Except, as you say, indirectly by attracting what we deem to be beneficial. Versus.
Yep.
Okay.
Well,
and if anyone would like to unmute themselves if they have any questions they'd just like to ask verbally. Here's a continuation. I notice a location where I have an arbor with native honeysuckle. It is covered with aphids. The ground-based honeysuckle doesn't show that. Interesting.
Ground-based.
Well, the honeysuckle can either crawl or I think she means the parts of the same honeysuckle at the ground level.
Right.
And
I see. Well,
maybe there's something that attacks the aphids at the ground level that doesn't get them higher
it's
up.
possible, and it's also just possible that down at ground level is a different environment, you know, and then up on the arbor it's hotter and sunnier, and nature is
yes, and that part of the plant more stressed.
Yeah,
that's a possibility too.
But you know, it is interesting that if you aphids are like the tiny chickens of the garden, really. If you have no aphids, you have to wonder, you know, where's the rest of life then? You know, I was amazed to learn that hummingbirds feed their babies aphids oftentimes. And so, you know, they're important to many things. Honeysuckle aphids are usually seasonal, someone says. And that is a really interesting observation, because we are really comfortable with the idea that plants are seasonal, but insects are seasonal as well. And sometimes they show up and they're a problem for a little while. And then if you're patient, or if like me, you're a lazy gardener, then sometimes they just go away.
Exactly.
If you wait. Okay. Oh,
And Harold Hirsch, do notice the soldier beetles on the arbor.
yes.
So yeah, the beetles are active higher.
I just love those soldier beetles. One time at the Sonoma State Garden, this is another lazy gardener story. The lupids were absolutely covered with those big black aphids. And a couple of days later, those plants were covered with soldier beetles. And so over the course of about a week, we went from covered with aphids to covered with soldier beetles to just looking great.
Yeah.
No. Aphid symbiosis. Yes. So most of these homopterans, and aphids are a good example. They excrete sugar. Okay, they're sucking up all of this fluid from the plants, and they're getting excess sugar actually, and they excrete it. And the ants harvest the sugar, and they protect the aphids or other like scale insects or other homopterans, and they will protect them from other predators and pretty vigorously protect them. So oftentimes what you really need to do is to control for ants. And I have really found this true on citrus, especially. Make sure that the citrus branches aren't touching your house, or that there isn't some other avenue, but you can use, tanglefoot or other ant controls down at the base of the citrus. Prevent the ants from getting up there. And then all of these other predators and parasitoids can come in and attack the scale insects or whatever it is that is attacking your citrus. More leaf mulch for me, then, somebody said. Yes, please.
Okay, that's wonderful. Well, thank you very much.
I'm glad
back.
It was really fun to be able to talk to the Marin County group. Do find me on Facebook. If you have more questions, you can just look up Garden Allies and you'll find me, and I will respond to questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Frédérique, and hoping people who missed this will be able to see it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you. And we're trying to connect with Mia.
Okay.
And
yes, I will mute myself so that I can stay and listen to monarchs.
Excellent. Okay. Let me text Mia and find out where she's.
Can you hear me, Kristen?
Where she's gone. Oh, yes, there you are.
Oh, wonderful.
Wonderful.
What I'm hoping is that Alice might be able to put an important link in the chat.
And is this in regard to there's a video you mentioned that's
right. Mm-hmm.
Shown tomorrow. So for all of you in the audience, Mia is a longtime former Muir Woods Park Ranger, 40 years plus, I believe.
Yes.
Now the Marin Community Liaison with the Planning Division of the National Park Service. And she's speaking tonight as a volunteer on behalf of Xerces Society about the monarch situation in Marin County and the non-native tropical or Mexican milkweeds that we're trying to encourage people to replace with native species where those are appropriate. So take it away, Mia.
Okay, there we go. Oh, looks like I'm under your name. Is that okay?
Yes.
Great. So it's a real thrill to follow a very appropriate talk. Thank you, Frédérique, for such informative information. And I have your book, so I'm going to look and see. You kind of gave me a teaser there, all the beneficial things that monarchs do. But I'm going to talk right now about controversy, news, and a hot tip. So thank you for this opportunity to share a few timely things in my role as a Xerces Society volunteer. It will soon be my 26th year as a community scientist monitoring the migrating monarchs to Marin and hopefully the formation of overwintering clusters along the coast. While we were listening to the talk, I started getting pictures of clusters already forming in Bolinas, hot off the press news. They've arrived and they're forming clusters. Very, very exciting. However, in that quarter of a century of monitoring, I have witnessed the precipitous decline of the population to the brink of nearly disappearing. I'm concerned, and I'm sure you are also. But it has been encouraging to see many taking action in their own gardens, in county public spaces, and even some official actions. We hope for good numbers. The early indicators are hopeful. Our colleagues up north reporting more and more in their gardens each day. And our friends up north say that they're gathering and waiting for a change in weather to continue the migration. First, however, a few words of appreciation. It was wonderful to see Vernon's picture of Asclepius fascicularis on the notice for tonight's meeting, and endless appreciation to Doreen for sharing the location of native milkweed patches in Marin. It's the basis for OneTam work to monitor and develop care plans. And also, Doreen, we found a few more patches, so we'll share that with you for a complete list. I also wish to acknowledge Charlotte Torgovitsky because of her wonderful in-depth understanding of monarch biology and the way she shares it so well. She has currently helped us understand that one of the many threats monarchs face, a protozoa fondly known as OE, has always been present, but now there's compelling evidence that this disease is a threat of varying impact in North America and throughout the year. But due to its year-round presence in our mild Marin area and possible prevalence at the time of migration and overwintering, it has a greater effect here. Responsible action could minimize it, but we've learned that urging such action such as cutting back tropical or planting native milkweed only where milkweed once grew, goes unheeded. The long-term impacts are still unknown, but the immediate tragedy is often experienced as a monarch monitor. I know each monarch, especially now, really counts. So let's keep them healthy with methods we know work. Tomorrow morning, please get up early, bright and early, because there's a new episode of KQED's Deep Look. This is a feature that will share the latest science. And thanks to Alice Kaysen, with helping us get a peek at it and providing Marin sites for filming, we know it is compelling. Please get up early to watch it. So that's one of the reasons I asked to have a few moments tonight, was to make sure you knew that Deep Look will be on tomorrow. And of course, you can see it on YouTube later, and we'll have a link up in a few minutes. Okay, so what we're going to learn is how tropical, by not going dormant, builds the OE spore throughout the season, so that the heaviest load of spores is late, which is now, as monarchs should be going into diapause. That is the shutting down of the sex hormones, so that they will focus on nectaring to build up their body fat and focus on migrating to the coast. For us, that would be traveling to Bolinas, Stinson Beach, Muir Beach, or Fort Baker. Instead, there's a double whammy. There's the untimely breeding, which interrupts the cycle of migration and seeking the protection of the coastal groves. And there's also disease, which leads often to mortality and often to weakness. Okay, to get back to some other news here, a little over a year and a half ago, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had been petitioned to list the monarch butterfly as endangered. They didn't do so. They precluded such protection because there were higher priorities and not enough staff. But what they did say at the beginning of their hearing was they found it so remarkable that no one had waited for a listing. Everybody across the United States had got busy planting in their gardens, in their public spaces, protecting in agricultural areas. The list of what people are doing goes on and on and on. Well, in our county, we have planted native milkweed in our gardens, in our public spaces, such as the Bay Model. And I'd like to share with you 2 specific actions that have happened in this county in the last 2 months. One was in the middle of August, when our agricultural commissioner took the bold action after learning that tropical milkweed is listed as a class 2 noxious pest. He took the bold action of banning the sale of tropical milkweed in our nurseries. And this was a major step to encourage the planting of natives and to give us gardeners an immediate way we could take action to protect monarchs. So that was very bold of Stephen Parnay. We thank him for being a leader in helping offer a healthy choice. The other thing that happened in September was the Board of Supervisors passed a resolution of conservation and protection of monarchs in our county. Only the second countywide body in the whole nation to take that kind of action. So we applaud our local government for taking steps to help monarch butterflies. And now to just get to a couple of things to wrap up. There's actually a couple of actions that the Native Plant Society helps in so many ways. One of them, I don't really have to go over because it's kind of a no-brainer. No pesticides. That's one of the most insidious things, especially in this era when we're celebrating Rachel Carson publishing Silent Spring 60 years ago. We know the ravages of pesticides through our food chain. But the 2 specific actions is to plant the right plant, which is native milkweed in the right place where it once grew. So in Marin, that would be inland, not near the coast, inland. So yes, in Novato, like Marcia's doing, all those wonderful school waysides in San Rafael. It would be public spaces like the Fairfax Library and the Bay Model. So plant native, that would be Asclepias fascicularis, the narrow leaf milkweed, or Asclepias speciosa, the showy milkweed. So plant natives, kind of a natural for the Native Plant Society, and plant it where it once grew. Right plant, right place. And which one not to plant? Well, we know it, Asclepias corysabica, Boo Hiss, the tropical. And of course, plant nectar plants. There's also another common value that we have, which is the importance of planting native plants to restore and steward the native landscapes that are so important to so many life things, as we heard our speakers share. Okay, this is complex. There is much to learn. There's things we don't know, but for CNPS, it's natural to respond because people want to help. So just say right plant, right place. Thanks for offering examples, plants at sales, spreading the word as we welcome monarchs. The migration is underway. Watch for them, and tomorrow, watch the show. I think there's a link in there. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Alice, for being such a leader in this and also helping nurseries through your education to provide information about why plants are so important to monarchs and all living things. Thanks, Kristen, for the time tonight.
And thank you, Mia.
And I just want to jump in and mention that
Okay.
January's talk is going to be via an monarch sanctuary on his ranch in West Marin. So all about monarchs. Our January meeting.
Thank you for the invite. What's exciting when Laura invited us is not only another example, but also we'll have the population trends and things to share. So, and hopefully in the announcement, we can give some tips about where to go
Right.
view.
And there are just a few more things in the chat. There's about the monarchs. Laura Lovett clarifies that it's the ocean coast that we're referring to, not the bay, which is why the bay model garden is still okay for milkweeds. Recently noticed a monarch in my backyard on a coyote bush, flowers nectaring for 5 to 10 minutes. Is the male plant also a food source or nectar source?
That is such
Maybe
a good
for
point.
Yeah.
My understanding is that the male plant is actually much more nectar rich. And one thing that's really important, it's kind of a data gap, is just which native plants that monarchs tend to favor. And so Alice and I and others are asking people when they see monarchs nectaring to please let us know what kind of plants so we can promote those natives, because you want plants that are blooming and are good nectar sources in the fall when they are migrating through, and through the winter when they need to leave the clusters to build up their body fat. And coyote bush is an outstanding one, as is aster and manzanita, goldenrod. Maybe others can put some choices in the chat there.
And Larry Bathgate mentions that he's had native milkweed growing in his garden for over 5 years. He lives in Tamalpais Valley. Is this okay? He's had monarchs flitting around his home all summer long.
Yeah, there's two really important points. And it kind of goes to Laura's point that when we talk about not planting milkweed near the coast, we mean the ocean coast. Thank you for Laura for bringing that up. Tam Valley is on the east side of the Coast Range, so it's a safe place to plant milkweed. And there's a number of highly sought after milkweed plants in Tam Valley, so it's a great spot. And also we urge patience. Many people report planting milkweed and needing to wait a few years before monarchs find it. And there's a couple reasons. One is there haven't been too many monarchs to find it, but also it takes a while for the plant to get established.
Yes, and Julie Bongers points out that Annie's Annuals still sells the tropical milkweed, so they might not have heard about the ordinance. Now, what is the scope of the ordinance? Is that all of was that all of California?
No, the tropical was declared a noxious Class B weed in California, and that allowed agricultural commissioners to ban it in their county. And Ventura County was the first, and Marin is the second. So it's just countywide. So that's why Annie's hasn't followed suit yet.
Got it. Okay. And then there's another milkweed native to South Africa. There are quite a few different milkweeds, of course, and of course other American species of milkweed too. But I think she's thinking of the tall, woody one with the very large, sort of bristly seed pods.
Right.
I've forgotten the species.
Gomphorus. Yeah. We don't, you know, for all kinds of reasons, I'm always proud when I say CNPS that my own agency, NPS, is tucked in there, but we support native plants, native landscapes. And so even though the South African balloon milkweed is not banned, we don't encourage it because we support the native. And a really important thing about the native milkweed is it goes dormant in the fall.
Right.
So the monarchs are already in sexual diapause because they're migrating, but they just don't find the native milkweed because it's gone dormant. And the balloon milkweed from South Africa and the tropical don't go dormant. And so that's where the problem lies. They build up the OE parasite and they encourage ongoing breeding. So it's that quality of staying green and available that is so dangerous.
Exactly. And Carrie suggests monkey flower as a nectar source
Great.
for the season, which reminds me, we saw quite a lot of sticky monkey flower up on Mount Vision last night, didn't we? That was great. And Harold Hirsch did take photos, which he can send or post on iNaturalist. Tithonia, not native, but an excellent nectar plant. Yes, we need to initiate talking with Annie's annuals. What do you know about the European paper wasp? Apparently in the East Bay, it predates on monarchs, on monarch larvae.
Yeah, we have many reports. I don't know if Alice chooses to unmute herself, but she has some very helpful advice that she offers. But that is, it's not just OE that is a challenge. There's a number of native predators like tachinid flies, and then other non-natives such as the paper wasp. It's a real challenge.
And if our native milk, pardon?
Oh, I'm sorry.
If our native milkweed is still green, do you recommend cutting it down? And if so, when?
Yeah, good question. So one of the big reasons that monarch butterflies are challenged is all the effects that we feel from climate change, which could be a prolonged warm fall. It could be hot spells during winter, and it could confuse our native milkweed and keep it green longer. And so even though I don't know too much about this, I think I would recommend cutting it back. For those of you who wish to keep tropical in your garden, this is especially good advice, cut it back. But back to the native, I would recommend cutting it back because there is this overall challenge of climate change. And I've heard varying recommendations, which is to cut it back around fall equinox, so that when monarchs, often a harbinger of autumn, start moving in, they won't find it.
Okay, so that's timely,
Yeah.
timely information. And last question, I think we'll make this one. Diane Lynch says she has about 25 Asclepias fascicularis and 2 tropical left in the garden. Turns out the butterflies don't like it at all. I'm not sure which it she's referring to, whether it's the fascicularis or the tropical, but the rats love it and have decimated it. So not sure which species she means. And Larry Bathgate, I have Verbena Benariensis growing in my yard and the monarchs love it. That's non-native. That one actually can be a bit invasive, especially along stream sides. So I would be a little careful about where that species is planted. It's from Brazil, I believe. And it was the fascicularis, Diane says, that was not eaten by the butterflies. Diane, where is your garden? We'll see. Tiburon. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, she might have problems with the predation of the larvae as we have elsewhere in Marin. Okay, so rats ate her fascicularis. Darn them. Well, thank you everyone for participating and Mia for speaking, and we will hear more from you in January.
Great. Everyone get your coffee or tea in the morning and watch that new.
Yeah, what time does it air?
Well, that's a good question. I couldn't find it, but I heard 6:30. The nice thing about this modern world is you can click onto the YouTube and get it later. But
Good.
if you want to be the first to see it, try bright and early, pre-dawn.
Okay. So thank you, everyone. And we don't yet have a speaker lined up for November, so stay tuned with regard to that. and look forward to seeing you all then. Good night.
Good night.